Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2026. We have apologies from Claire Baker. Our first item of business is a decision on whether to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you. Our next item of business is the consideration of 2 statutory instruments. The Social Security Uprating Scotland Order 2026 draft, the Social Security Uprating Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2026 draft. So these instruments are laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve them before they come into force. I welcome to the meeting Shirley-Anne Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice. I also welcome her officials from the Scottish Government, Kyle Murray, Procedural and International Policy Team Leader, Social Security Policy, and Fiona Bone, Lawyer. So thank you very much for joining us today. And following this evidence session, the committee will be invited in the upcoming agenda item to consider motions to approve both affirmative instruments. And I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate if there is one that follows. So I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some opening remarks on both SSIs.
Thank you very much and good morning, Convener. I welcome this opportunity to speak to the draft uprating regulations and order. The Scottish Government is clear about the importance of protecting the real value of social security assistance, particularly at a time when household costs remain under pressure. Uprating payments in line with inflation is essential to ensuring that support continues to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. These draft instruments increase all social security payments by 3.8% in line with the 12 months to September 2025 rate of CPI, a leading measure of inflation. The exception to this is the industrial death benefit, which will be increased by 4.8% in alignment with the DWP, reflecting growth in earnings. I would also like to take this opportunity to confirm that following its introduction during 2027-28, the new Scottish Child Payment Premium rate for children under 1, announced as part of the Scottish Budget, will be included in the regulations that we bring forward annually to uprate benefits in line with inflation. In addition to increasing the payment rates, these draft regulations make a number of other changes, increasing the earnings limit from £196 to £204 for both carer support payments and carers' allowance, will ensure carers in paid work can continue to access support as wages rise. Other minor changes are intended to update legislation so that it accurately reflects the policy intention or to correct drafting errors. These include amending the carer support payment regulations to clarify the effective date of the end of a carer support award when a client has died, and addressing a typographical error where the year 2026 was unintentionally omitted from a provision. The regulations also amend the pension age winter heating payment regulations to clarify that each member of a couple should be treated as though they were entitled to the qualifying benefit to ensure that the original regulations operate as intended for couples. The regulations also contain saving and transitional provisions so that the previous values of assistance are still payable in certain circumstances. This includes provisions addressing an issue related to the transitional rate of ADP in 25-26, where it was not uprated in the legislation, although it's important to note that people were still paid the correct uprated amount. Subject to parliamentary approval, these increased rates and additional changes will come into effect from April 2026. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So we'll now move to questions. Our questions on both instruments will be obviously directed to you, but again, I would reiterate that you're welcome to invite any officials to respond should you wish to do so. So I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to your team. I just wondering, I think we've had the discussion before, but will the Scottish Government change the legislative basis of best stocked foods so that it is covered by the statutory duty to uprate for inflation?
So in 2025, we extended the legal obligation to uprate in line with inflation so that it applies to all the benefits delivered by the 2018 Act. And it is our intention that Best Start Foods will be brought under the 2018 Act in the future so that the statutory uprating duty will apply automatically. But in the interim period, we've made that public commitment to continue to increase Best Start Foods by inflation. So that will happen in practice, and in the future we will look to change the footing of the Best Start Foods to allow that to happen by statute.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison. Thanks.
Cabinet Secretary, just a brief question. Just wondering when the government will next review its options for operating going forward. And the reason for asking that, as I can see from my briefing, that the Scottish Commission on Social Security noted that analysis was last done on operating options in 2024 and said these should be reviewed and done again in due course was the terminology. So yeah. I suppose, what does due course mean?
So I do note the point that SCOS made in their response. What I would say is that the work that has been undertaken, which has been discussed extensively at committee previously around this, has been very thorough, I think. We do believe that future analysis should therefore be carried out if there's been substantive changes on the advice of inflationary measures, whether that's from the Office for Statistics Regulation or the Office for National Statistics. So those are the types of substantive changes that I think would therefore require and suggest that the Scottish Government should review its current policy. So that's what we would intend to do in the future.
Okay, so as a matter of course, when required, based on events and circumstances, rather than in due course with a set time in the future?
Yes, I think we have looked at this not just once since we've began the journey for social security. I certainly am very content with the position that we have at the moment, and I think it's important that we do look to still question that policy position if there was to be a substantive change such as the ones that I've mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. When considering the medium-term financial planning, how does the Scottish Government take account for the possibility that inflation might differ from the forecasts that are set, and what would that impact be on social security spending?
So clearly, as committee is aware, the Government uses the Scottish Fiscal Commission's independent forecasts for the budget and the medium-term financial planning, and that includes the latest economic and inflation forecasts. Any increase in future years' inflation compared to the SFC's forecast will be managed through the future budget allocations. As committee is aware, we need to take account of these things, and the Government has always produced a balanced budget looking at the fiscal sustainability and ensuring that we continue to prioritise social security as part of that. But the forecast provided by the Scottish Fiscal Commission will allow us to ensure that we're looking at that in a medium-term financial planning window as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think that concludes all of our questions to the Cabinet Secretary. So our next item is the formal consideration of motion S6M 20533, that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Social Security Uprating Scotland Order 2026 draft be approved. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary, if she wants to move, speak or move the motion. Thank you.
Formally moved, Convener.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to invite any contributions from members. No? Okay, so thank you. The question is that motion S6M 20533 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville be approved. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Okay, we will now move on to the formal consideration of motion S6M 20602 that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee recommends that the Social Security Uprating Miscellaneous Amendments Scotland Regulations 2026 draft be approved, and I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion.
Moved, Convener.
Thank you. I now invite members if they've got any contributions. No. Okay. So thank you. So the question is that motion S6M 20602 in the name of Shirley Ann Somerville be approved. Are we all agreed? Okay. Thank you. So the committee will report on the outcome of both instruments in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve drafts of the reports for publication. Do members agree? Okay, thank you. So I want to thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials for providing evidence today. I now briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a change of witnesses. Thank you. So our next item of business is a roundtable discussion on the funeral support payment. I welcome our witnesses to today's meeting. Adam Stakura, Director of Policy, Communications and External Affairs, Age Scotland. John Halliday, Chair, Caledonia Funeral Aid. Jim Brodie, Managing Director, Brodie's Funeral Services, who is also attending on behalf of the National Association of Funeral Directors. Jerry Boyle, Regional Manager, Dignity Funeral Directors. And Andrew Purvis, Chief Operating Officer and Director, William Purvis Funeral Directors. So the meeting is a roundtable format, which we hope will enable a sort of free-flowing conversation. And the committee is very much in listening mode today because I told them earlier that that's what they were. No. So again, if you want to indicate to me, if you wish to speak as well. So the way the format of the meeting is that we intend to have 4 main themes today, and we'll have about an hour and 15 minutes, give or take, as well. So I encourage members and witnesses to be succinct as possible in your questions and answers. So I am going to introduce the first theme, which actually concerns the issue of payment of funeral support payment to the client or the funeral director. As I say, we are trying to keep this as free-flowing, so I very much welcome all your contributions as well. So, as I said, I'd like to focus on the issue of payment direction, specifically the effects of giving clients a choice about whether the funeral support payment is made directly to them or to the funeral director. So that we know from what we've received that around 60% of payments are already issued directly to funeral directors. But we've heard concerns as well from some stakeholders about non-payment and the potential financial risk as well. So I'm keen to explore the scale of the risk and the scale of that issue, and whether the evidence supports any structural change, and whether there are any sort of proportionate alternatives that protect both bereaved families and funeral providers as well. So, first question to you is, are we talking about a small minority of cases? Or is this something a bit more kind of widespread? Okay, Jim, would you like to come in?
Yes, it is a small. It's not a huge amount. The vast majority of people that we serve, they look after, they are aware that it's a fee that's got to be paid to us. The problem is, it's the unintentional effect that when we get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that don't pay, and you've got to remember that we're paying the burial and cremation fees as well, so we're not only losing our account, we're having to pay out £2,500 to £3,000 for someone else. So when we don't get paid for that funeral, that affects everybody else. There are funeral directors out there who are half a dozen funerals away from being out of business. The market is very tough at the moment, and people are taking on this work in partnership with the Scottish Government that they will get paid. They take the funeral on, the money gets then diverted to the applicant, and they're left with a bill, £3,000, £4,000, £5,000, which they've got to pay for because they know they're not going to recover it.
Okay.
So it's a small amount. I'm not saying it's a huge problem, but it is a problem, the fact that everyone that doesn't pay, it can take 10 funerals to recover that cost.
Right,
and that
okay.
affects everybody else's funeral fees because we have to recover it in some way. Excuse my stammer.
No, it's okay.
Okay?
No, that's great. Thanks for
I
coming
hope that, it's not a big amount, but it's a significant vector in what happens to everybody else.
Okay. Thank you for that. Would you like to come in? Sorry, Jerry, I can't see everybody's names. That's perfect. Yeah, thanks, Jerry.
Hi. Okay. So I think Jim touched on it as well. So I think the important thing to say is that it's that we have to most of the burial and cremation authorities will be predominantly owned by local authorities. They don't have any bad debt in terms of burial and cremation because funeral directors pay. They send all their accounts to funeral directors, and funeral directors pay them. If funeral directors don't pay them, they don't get access to the burial or the cemetery. If they don't pay their bills. So I think it's the double done effect. That so not only do we not get paid, that we also get guarantee payment, irrespective of whether we ourselves are guaranteed payments. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Would anyone else like to come in? John? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Funeral aid, we do some funeral arranging, but our perspective is different. We're a charity and social enterprise and work with people in funeral poverty a lot of the time, providing advice. So we've got a slightly different angle, and that is to say we've got less to gain by saying that it should come directly to funeral directors most of the time. I broadly share the view that at the moment there's a problem in the system that for a minority of cases, but it is an important minority of cases, the payment is going to families who aren't then passing that on to funeral directors. I think that's some problem. I understand that that's offset by the idea of a non-judgmental approach and an empowering approach for people facing poverty. I understand that. That's actually normally what I'd advocate. I think the reason to act on this is something slightly different, which is the wider market effect that this is happening here. So for ourselves, because we work with people in funeral poverty, we don't expect any deposit to be paid. We lose a lot of money because of that, frankly. There's no two ways about it. Private sector funeral directors generally require either the full amount paid up front for someone who's likely not to be able to pay in the longer term, or a significant deposit. That makes it hard for people to start to have the first conversation in which someone is brought into the care of the funeral director. Because of the risk to other funeral directors that need to look after their profitability, what we're finding is people are being turned away on occasions from funeral directors because they're on benefits or because they're going to apply for funeral support payment. Not everyone, not all funeral directors, but it happens enough in the market that's a problem. So we often end up dealing with people where they've been to 1, 2, 3 funeral directors, all of whom say, because you can't pay up front, we're worried about funeral support payment. We've no evidence that that would end up coming to us. They're worried about getting started with that person. So I think that wider market impact is creating the biggest problem here. It's that for the very small number of people where they would keep the money themselves and not pass it on, they're creating this ripple effect in which a much broader range of people on benefits are now being negatively affected by the kind of natural correction of people who are worried about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to comment? Yep, Andrew, thank you.
Thank you. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the people that are claiming this benefit or eligible for this benefit are often in financial poverty, and so suddenly to have a huge chunk of money arrive in their bank account, they then are faced with an option of whether to pay this to the funeral director or they actually get the chance to keep it. And I think that's a very difficult position to put some people in, and I actually think it's an unfair position to put some people in as well.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That's a good point. Okay, John, do you want to come back in? Yeah.
Just to add something else, so in the event that it can't be, or it's decided that it's not the right thing to make it that the funeral director is the default, I think there's a couple of small changes that could be made that are different to that maybe help the proportionate changes. So one is the fact that there's a lack of notification from Social Security Scotland to funeral directors to say that an FSP application has been made in which that funeral director has been identified. So funeral directors being identified to Social Security Scotland by members of the public, but then that funeral director isn't made aware that that's happened. Even correcting that small change, which I understand has a data consequence, by the way, but even correcting that small change in which you say your funeral director has been identified in an FSP claim could actually make a big difference to the sense that funeral directors would feel secure that someone had actually progressed matters. So we're saying this is against my business interests to say this because we end up dealing with the consequence of that. But I think that is one way of doing it. The other is the fact that during the process people can say they have named the funeral director as the person to whom the funds will come and then later change it such that, again, without notification to the funeral director, that can have been changed. So sometimes we work with people, we collaborate with them to fill in the form and then later they are asked again, do you want the money to go directly to you or do you want it to pay off your debt? And so just correcting those bits where if the funeral director was more clearly informed about what that was happening there, they would know more clearly when to be more relaxed about working with people on benefits.
Okay, okay, thanks for that information. Jerry, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the point at which the families come to funeral directors, then we have to make a commercial decision as to whether do we deal with them straight away, or do we ask them to come up with some money, or do we say, well, actually wait until you have the funeral support payment and then we'll do the funeral. So each funeral director has to make a commercial judgment on that. At the point where they might say, as John alluded to there, they might say the money's to go to the funeral director. Afterwards, they do get the opportunity they're asked again, are you sure that's what you want? You know, do you want the money to come to you? And again, as Andrew said, that's putting people in an unfair situation. But at the point where you're at the point whether they either get the funeral support payment or sometimes don't get it, the funeral director's in a position where they might already have carried out that funeral. And if you take any other commercial assessment of somebody's ability to pay for any commercial service, that would be looked at the point at which you took it on. Funerals are different. Funeral directors don't do that. And actually, if you've taken on the funeral and then for whatever reason, where they either take the money and don't give it to you, or they just don't get the money, they're in that economic band where funeral directors are very limited in their choices as to what they can do to actually recover the money, because the people don't have any money to recover.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay. Alexander, do you want to come in?
Can I just talk on that, Jerry? I mean, so roughly how many people would fall into that category that you are giving them the opportunity, but then at the end of the day they don't actually have the financial resource and you then have to take that hit? I mean, is that happening on a regular basis or is it ad hoc? Or
so we can only go by we can give people advice as to what the criteria is for the thing, but the decision as to whether somebody gets the funeral support payment or not isn't down to the funeral director. So we can offer best advice, I think, as best as you could put it. I think, you know, the funeral directors have to take a commercial decision whether they go ahead, you know, whether they deal with people when they come in and they don't ask them to wait until they get the payment. We don't wait until to get the payment. We deal with them as they come in. And you know, for the most part, for the most part, that works out all right, and we can come to some arrangement with families. But you know, funeral directors are, generally speaking, funeral directors in general shouldn't be asked to be taking that gamble, I don't think, as to whether they might or whether they might not get paid.
And that puts the family in a very difficult position too, because you know they're relying on what might happen, and so are you, and both could not. But you're the one who's going to be financially worse off. And
you know, you're on the funeral directors serve their communities and have done for generations. You quite quickly would get a reputation for being helpful or not being helpful, and you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You know, you're either the best funeral director in the world, but you're the poorest funeral director in the world because you then don't get paid, or you stick to your guns and you ask for some money, and then you're all the bad kids in the world.
That we're triggering some lots of discussion here, so thank you for that. So I'm trying. Jeremy wants to come in, John, and then I believe Jim again. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm interested, I think we'll come on to this later, but I'm interested, since we're here, is how long is it taken, from your experience, from someone makes an application to Social Security Scotland before we get the decision back? Perhaps John knows that. And secondly, I suppose my big concern is in a more rural area where there is only one firm. Obviously, you know, in the cities you've got a multitude of choices, but what happens in rural areas where a family maybe has a bad reputation or something's happened previously? What would happen in that situation, from your experience, if, say, the local undertaker in wherever said no? What would happen on that occasion?
Jim, do you want to come in and invite John?
I'll take the second one first. I can only comment, obviously, for ourselves. We have refused no one ever, reputational, whatever. We have taken on funerals we know was bad debt waiting to happen. But that's how you support. That's how we support our communities. We're part of the community. So yes, that is a financial risk that we take every time we accept a funeral. The rural areas, we have 2 parlours where we are the only funeral director in the village. What a better word. No, don't want to quote Little Britain too much, but we are the only one there. We don't refuse anybody, but unlike Jerry with Dignity, that's a big company. We had to make a decision probably 3.5 years ago that if the money wasn't in place, we wouldn't conduct a funeral. So we bring the person into our care, they'd be in a refrigerated facility, we would give them as much support and advice as possible, but the funeral wouldn't be arranged, a day and time arranged, until the monies were paid. We had to do that. So we have no bad debt because of funeral support payments now, because we will not do the funeral until the money's been paid to us. And that's for everybody's security, so that we can say to every client, you're being treated exactly the same. It goes against our grain, 100%, but it's the only way that we can be fair and equal and treat everybody with the same amount of respect.
Okay. Appreciate. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. John, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I'll go backwards as well in order. So when we set up Caledonia Funeral Aid around 10 years ago, we were doing the founding, and we assumed that because the majority of people facing poverty in Scotland are around the Greater Glasgow area, that's where we'd find most of the people who needed our support. Actually, because of the larger amount of competition and funeral directors in that area, we've actually found that rural areas, it's not the majority, but rural areas disproportionately represent people who come to seek support with us. So people where they haven't got a second choice of place to go, or potentially don't have any viable option available to them. And actually, interestingly, Edinburgh and surrounds, where there seems to be, burials are more expensive, there's higher costs, and also there's, and this is no slight on any one funeral director, there seems to be more examples of funeral directors where people struggle to get started with them because there's like a hesitancy for people to take on cases of people on benefits. So we disproportionately get that in Edinburgh, as it happens and around. Again, not half of our work. So it does come up a lot. And just on your point about how often does this come up where people kind of fall foul of it, I mean, I'm not giving statistics, I'm giving a single anecdote, but we had an example recently where someone very earnestly entered an agreement with a funeral director for a funeral, assuming they would get funeral support payment. I think everyone at first glance would have assumed that was true. The particular person experienced really deep poverty for a long time, but happened to be on contribution-based ESA rather than income-related ESA, that, as you might imagine, they weren't quite conversant enough in their benefits to realise they wouldn't be eligible. Everyone had conversations about how they definitely were getting this. Like, it's absolutely sewn up. And a private sector funeral director lost the entire sum there, and it created a really hostile kind of relationship in terms of trying to follow up on bad debt out of that. So everyone was worse off. Funeral director, that person's life is significantly worse for having that interaction. And it's basically based on the natural misunderstanding of the benefit system that people face because there's cut-off points that are unclear. So entering that and having a period in which you're having to take that gamble as a funeral director isn't just affecting funeral directors and their profitability, it's affecting, you know, the lives of people in poverty just there.
Yeah. I'm going to invite Bob in, and I think, Jerry, did you want to come back in? Yeah. Did anyone else? Sorry, I'm trying to look down to them, see who's got their hands up. Yeah, and you come, Bob.
A brief thought. I was looking that in 25-26 there was £12.1 million paid out in funeral support payments. So we're quite talking whether that's a sufficient number to fund the value of the services. In a moment, I'm sure we'll look at that. But that's still a lot of money in the system. So if it's only a small amount of funeral directors that are being hit by this, but disproportionately, is there any risk share within the system that could be done? Because some funeral directors are doing okay out of this and others aren't. So those that are willing to take on people in low incomes and benefits where there's a higher risk, a risk share between funeral directors may be a way that some of the smaller providers can step forward as the only funeral service in the local area, and they know that if they're let down for whatever reason, that they have the heft of the sector standing behind them. Have any of those discussions taken place? Or should they?
Do you want to come in and then I'll invite Jerry in? Jim, sorry.
In a word, no.
Should they?
Yes and no. Because, well, I see where you're coming from, but you remember that the funeral trade is a very fractious sector at the moment. It really is. There are people who won't talk. You know, I would say the only thing you'll get 5 undertakers in one room to agree on is that the 6th who's not there is an idiot. Literally. This is part of the problem we have.
They should get into politics.
You don't want that. Risk sharing. There's a simple way to do that. In fact, that the social security pay the burial or the cremation fees directly.
Yeah.
That's the risk sharing, as far as I would say, makes most sense. Instead of paying the funeral director the whole amount, if it's and also it means that the local authorities and the burial and cremation authorities, they are actually taking part in this system, because at the moment they take no money off. Most funeral directors take money off for a funeral support payment funeral. They reduce the cost. So we're taking money off. Councils don't take any off a burial, or a crematorium don't take any off a cremation. If you have a child under 18 who dies, they can apply to the government for recompense for that burial or cremation. We can't. So what's the difference between a child under 18 and someone who's in such a severe financial position they cannot afford a respectful funeral? My argument would be it's the whole sector that's involved here, not just funeral directors. Burial cremation authorities are guaranteed to get paid either by us or by the state. Therefore, they have no risk at all. The funeral sector is taking it all on our own shoulders, and you know, as a stakeholder, if there's no funeral directors, there's no funerals, and then you've got a real problem. That was all. Sorry.
No.
I'm trying to keep it quiet. That's short. I can't go short. Sorry.
Thank you. Jerry, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so a couple of things is that, just touching on Jim's last point there, where the burial and the cremation fees are paid, and they are paid and they're paid in full, but there's no, there doesn't seem to be any, so if the council wanted to double their burial fees next year, then those fees will be paid. You know, whereas the amount that's paid to funeral directors is capped. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out is that whether you take on a funeral when the family comes in first to see you, or whether you decide to wait until the funeral support payment, there is an unintended consequence of that in the delay to public mortuaries. and hospitals, and whether in the throughput of deceased through mortuaries. You know, a funeral director might not want to go to a public mortuary and remove a deceased into their care. You know, it might take 3 or 4 weeks for that family maybe to come up, or for the funeral support payment to go through. You know, so you would be reluctant, I think, to bring somebody into your care too soon, in case the family change their mind, in case there's a difficulty, in case they don't get the funding. Once you've got that deceased in your premises, the hospital won't take it back. The hospital won't take the deceased back again. You know, so that there is, you know, it causes an ongoing delay to public mortuaries and the pressure on the NHS mortuaries in particular.
Okay, yeah, quickly. No, come on.
Jerry, in 2015, we had a Frisbee capacity of 9. It's now 40. Such is the length of time stretched in the last 10 years. It's went from 2 to 3 days to 2 to 3 weeks. And if a funeral support payment's involved, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, quite easily. So that, you know, there is pressures that this, as I say, this tiny wee ripple, as John said, works its way out and affects the entire mechanism.
And the provision of that mortuary equipment and refrigeration equipment on the part of funeral directors isn't cheap.
It's not cheap.
No, okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, from what I've heard as well, I was kind of going to sort of try and turn it around. So, obviously, given that the majority of the awards are actually, you know, they already go directly to the funeral directors, do you think removing the claimant choice entirely, do you think that would be proportionate to the scale of the issue that you are describing today?
I would say yes. I mean, I can't think of any other benefit where the benefits agency goes back to the claimant and asks them they want the money paid somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah, Jim.
This was so all the committee meeting right at the word go. I mean, there was 40 and the 3 funeral directors, so we're kind of outnumbered. But what we're seeing is that that's how we put it properly. In fact, no, I'll come back to that. I'll leave that. That's for now.
No, that's okay. John, would you like to come in? And before I do that, can I just remind Jeremy that of his interest if he wants to come in afterwards, or do you want to come in just now, Jeremy?
Oh, yeah, sorry, just for the record that I am the convener of the cross-party group on funerals and bereavement, and I have many friends that work for Purposes and know the family, just to put that on the record as well.
Okay, thank you. John.
Yeah, so, you know, if the question's, is it proportionate to remove the choice for it to go to the family? I'm reluctant. I think others might feel like that's the sort of correct, easy answer. I reluctantly agree that I think that is proportionate. I would not normally say that. I think giving choice to and empowerment to people in poverty, you know, when people can't pay for the roof over their head or put food on their table, giving them the choice of how they spend that is more important than making sure that private sector businesses' bills are paid. However, the impact this is having is causing this ripple effect out that's beyond just the few people who aren't paying. It's actually impacting on people who would, of course, have paid in the first place, who then don't have the choice of the market to go to any funeral director. It's meaning that people are stigmatised in going to a funeral director in the first place and saying, I can't pay up front, you're just going to have to take a chance on me. And I think that's creating a separate level of judgmentalism and disbenefit to those people that undermines the good principle that that decision was made on. So I'm reluctant to say yes, but I do think now it is proportionate. And if it can't be done, I think more needs to be done around how we use data to give more assurance to funeral directors that that payment is going to be made to them such that they can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Adam, would you like to come in?
Thanks. I kind of agree with John there. I suppose your question, what we're trying to work out here is the proportionality of it. And I think what we've heard is where there are a few cases that has a significant financial challenge on the operation of the funeral director, and it's significant. And I think while thinking about this inquiry, was thinking about what other systems are put in place for people in low income to kind of access essential services, and what comes to mind is legal aid, and where solicitors are very rarely engaging in it because it doesn't meet the cost. Therefore, the legal aid system is a very difficult one to navigate. So my slight fear is that does it get to a position where people who have died and families want to give their loved one a respectful and dignified send-off are unable to engage, whether it's because of the rurality of it or the lack of choice or anything else. That's a significant concern. I wonder whether the answer to those challenges are different to whether you give the family the choice about getting the money. Is there some other kind of scheme or financial assistance for funeral directors through Social Security Scotland, through the local authority, through the Scottish Government, about that kind of bad debt element? I think there are a lot of principles in Social Security Scotland and Scotland's social security system which probably need to be upheld as well. This is probably not an outlier in a sense, but that proportionality. So let's say there were 6,000 funerals last year for which funeral support assistance was, funeral support payment was granted. 4,000 of them are paid direct to funeral directors. 2,000 are, what number of that 2,000 are missing? Now, it's probably quite small, but as we've heard, it's a significant impact. That, in that sense, as a small number, would be disproportionate, but the proportionality is on the big impact it's having on the sector, where I wonder whether the fix is not so much about removing individuals' kind of rights and dignity, because funerals are costing a lot more than what the funeral support payment is doing, and even the kind of a basic kind of cover is probably half of what it really costs for some things. I wonder if there's a little bit more to think about that safety net, whether it's for funeral directors or whether it is just part of the issue about you've asked the first time, do you want to go direct to funeral directors, and then asking again, are you sure? Maybe some check-in on this, but to what degree do Social Security Scotland check that money is actually being paid, and how do they deal with that system too? But I think that actually understanding the number of people, what that financial cost is a really important part of this conundrum before you're able to determine whether it's actually proportionate or not for the number of people and all the other complications. I'm sure you want to get to the round table anyway around paying for funerals that are kind of respectful, not necessarily too jazzy, but just respectful. So that's a caution point about, after hearing all of that, understand the financial challenges there, and they will be significant. But is this the wrong kind of nut to crack? Is there another way to do it where there is a safety net of financial security for funeral directors to operate properly and not to then find a position, if you're on low income, your family is to then have no choice about where to, because it might not be the case. It might not be the case that, for instance, whether it's the cheapest options of maybe a direct cremation, that might not be in fitting with what the beliefs are of that family as well. So while there might be kind of financial alignment, there's something else we've got to do to respect people's kind of choice and really understanding the scale of the problem. I don't think we've got that number yet.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, again. Moving on, we'll move on to sort of the next theme, but maybe just leave it with you, and then you can kind of discuss it at the end. That the administration aspect of it, if that was reformed in some way, that it would reduce the risk, or if there's a middle ground. But I'll leave that question with you anyway. To the end till we hear further on the other themes that we've got. And the next theme is funeral poverty, and I'm going to invite Elena. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just before I get into that, I think it's probably worth mentioning that in the universal credit system with the DWP, claimants are often usually by default given all of their housing costs. So that is another instance in the system where people are having to then make payments directly to their landlord, and having that choice. They can obviously choose to have it directly paid to their landlord, but that's not the default position. And I think that speaks to what Dawn was talking about, the kind of principles there that are set out to give people that decision. that doesn't mean to say that people do not get themselves into extreme difficulties in terms of non-payment of rent and the follow-up that may happen from that. But that is one other part of the system that's the same. My question really is round about the effectiveness of the funeral support payment in addressing funeral poverty. And I don't know whether, we could maybe speak to whether the eligibility should be expanded, whether the flat rate needs to be increased, but I would be really keen to hear from the panel members on that aspect.
Okay, I think John would like to come in and then I'll invite Jim in. Thank you.
That there is any funeral expenses payment in England or funeral support payment in Scotland is enormously positively impactful on preventing. Funeral poverty is a term I endorse, and people, as I was setting up Caledonia Funeral Aid, it was becoming a term that was important. My actual focus is on persistent poverty, the actual just poverty people experience. And funerals are one of a few tipping points people experience. We spend a lot of time talking about the transition out of school, and if you can't get a first job, your whole life could be spent in poverty. When people retire, the whole dynamic of their life and income changes. When people lose a job, we have a whole insurance-based system, basically, as a country, in order to prevent that, causing people falling into persistent poverty for the rest of their life. Funerals are an unspoken tipping point in people's lives. It affects everyone. It's not something that uniquely affects people in certain circumstances. Everyone will get affected by this. And for far, far too many people, bereavement becomes a tipping point in which, they were maybe just about coping, but their life after that will never recover to where it was previously. Sometimes that's extreme because it's like the main earner in the household or a parent dies or something along those lines. But for everyone, just in that general case, the bereavement is just so overwhelming and such an emotional time. We see that people often fall into poverty. So we should think about the funeral support payment partly as a preventative measure to prevent persistent poverty. So funeral poverty is a great hook for me as a social enterprise and a charity to talk about, but we're in the interest of preventing long-term poverty and that kind of entrenching of poverty, often in people's lives who previously didn't realise there was someone who was going to experience that in their life. So that there exists one is fantastic. The current system in Scotland, where there's a lot of flexibility around who can be the claimant, how it's done, the processings, I'm not saying people don't have small complaints. It disproportionately makes an enormous difference in preventing poverty. Could more be done? Absolutely. I'll come on to that after giving other people the floor. But I think we just need to spend some time acknowledging the key role this plays as a preventative measure in saving people from a long-term poverty for a lot of people. Don't think of it as something where it's for people in poverty who then experience a bereavement. This is the benefit for them. It's the opposite. It's a preventative measure.
Want to come in, John?
Kind of sad to believe, but I actually agree with John. It's most unusual, but I do. And we're so keen to get into the nuts and bolts of this. It needs to be said that the FSP payment in Scotland is 1,000,000 times better than what the rest of the country has. I have to say that. I'm delighted that we do have it. All it needs is a few wee tweaks to make it, very much fair and honest. That was basically it. As I say, you stole my thunder there. Simple as that.
I know. Does anyone else want to come in?
Question about the kind of whether it's the level upon which funeral support payment is accepted. Members of the committee here might have heard me various times talking about pension credit of being a line that is probably too low for most people. If you look at, let's say, it was pensioners in Scotland, of which half have incomes lower than the income tax threshold, but maximum 15% are entitled to pension credit. There's a huge number of people who are living on very low income that probably don't have other financial provision for a funeral plan. Our latest research, which we published in the next kind of month or so, our sort of third big survey, would say about a third of older people, or even over 50s, have a financial arrangement for their funeral. That might be a big number, it might not be. Those on lower incomes are sort of more likely than the average to have one, but equally are also, say they're more likely than not to not be able to afford to do so. Actually, 50% more likely than our average of being unable to afford it if you're on incomes less than £15,000, which will then play into those challenges of being able to afford something which is modest, dignified, and being able to either, whether it's taking on debt or not being able to afford it, or actually not being able to pay the bills in the first place. I think there is a challenge there, but the funeral support payment wasn't necessarily initially set up to do that. This was part of that transition from the UK scheme to Scotland. There are I think, strong arguments to look at how that could be expanded. It's not a huge amount of money that we spend every single year. In the grand scheme of things, it's a lot, it's millions of pounds, about 10, 12 million pounds a year. It's not a huge amount. And I think the challenge that we have, though, is that in Scotland or in government, you don't have too many mechanisms to determine if somebody is worthy or not of it. And as we found ourselves with the pension age winter heating payment, moving to that kind of income tax based element was kind of the most logical thing. My point really is that I think a lot of people without it will really, really struggle. And the line is very, very low for being able to access important social security elements.
So one of the questions that I was thinking about in terms of eligibility as well was at the other age end of the spectrum. So if we think about young people, and if we think about those young people who might find themselves in a situation where they're having to take responsibility for a funeral of a parent or somebody that's been looking after them, and they're maybe a student and they're maybe in that kind of situation where they're not eligible, and as John pointed out before, you can have people who are on contributions-based benefits who are on that really low income end of the spectrum, and then people are tipped into that kind of poverty post funeral. So is there a call in the system for changing that? John?
Yeah, you've read out the things on my page. Sorry, I don't mean you read them out. I mean, it's like you read them out. Students often comes up. So there's people under 18 as well, but students at university, for instance, we've had far too many tragic examples of this. You can be eligible for universal credit during the summer in some situations, and so there is a way in which we can kind of, it almost feels like it's trying to game the system such that people can wait a long time after the funeral, but then claim it just in time because there's a narrow window where you're not technically in further education. So it seems perverse that those situations we have to find a loophole almost for people. That's kind of bonkers. And also people often then in a situation where if you leave your current student job, you could claim that or something like that. You could claim universal credit for 1 week and then become eligible. There's all these frustrations, pension credits on my page as well. Again, there's people where what we'd often do is deal with people who are obviously this person is facing poverty. The whole system wants to support this person. This is what Social Security is for, but they kind of don't fit with things. So either I think there's a need to just think about a few people who are excluded, which includes students not on universal credit, not eligible for it, some pensioners because there's no money in the estate, people on contribution-based ESA or JSA. But again, these need to be situations where we should expect people to go through more claim loopholes. They really need to prove, there really isn't any money. They are the correct person to be arranging this funeral. It's not that they're pretending to be the person who's responsible for a funeral when actually a different, closer family member should. So I think we'd expect a higher threshold of evidence to be provided, but these cases break our hearts. We see this all the time. These are the ones who filter through and end up coming through us quite often. One of the things we can provide that helps the system is a little bit like you're saying, protects the system, is we sometimes end up paying for people's funerals ourselves on the basis that we get some kind people pay for, when they use our services, they sometimes pay for a second person's funeral, and they just let us use our judgment to say, which is the poor family that needs that money? How can we make sure at least they get through that system? And the final group that's in that is people with no recourse to public funds. Now, the benefit system is going to hugely struggle to try to give benefits to people with no access to recourse to public funds, but those people die and people in their families die and they are responsible for funerals. And at the moment, basically, what we end up doing is saying you've no recourse to public funds, but through public health funerals, we will actually pay for your funeral, which is a recourse to public funds, if you see what I mean. So there's a wee bit there where we're sort of going through the motion of saying they couldn't possibly be eligible for a benefit, but we are actually going to pay for their funeral in a different way. So I feel like there's a bit there where a minority of people slip through the net. It might not be that we can fix FSP to fix it. It could be that we expand something in the welfare fund, for instance, Scottish Welfare Fund, to say a very small amount of money needs to be spent each year on people where it really is the heartbreak cases. And when you speak to them and you experience them, you'd understand no one will be questioning that we should be supporting them. It's sort of technicalities that they fall through. But tiny numbers, but the ones that really stick with us for years.
I have one further question, if that's all right, Gunnar. Yeah. All right, I'll ask this question. I didn't see Jerry. I guess one of the things that I've been grappling with, and I was the political lead that did help to set up East Ayrshire's respectful funeral system, but one of the things I've known that's happened since then, obviously, is with the Burial and Cremation Scotland Act in 2016, local authorities have been able to set their fees at what they see as being reasonable. Now, Jim, you've already kind of brought that into the conversation, and I just wanted to kind of maybe unpick a little bit and understand what driver does that create in terms of poverty when it comes to funeral costs, especially as those are the payments that will definitely be covered if we think about it in those terms under the funeral support payment. And is there work that needs to be done to understand what that looks like across the country and how quickly those fees are increasing and whether they're reasonable to be increasing in the way that they are?
Yep.
The burial fees are the main, burial are the main focus because they are expensive.
Yeah.
However, you speak to any councillor, they'll tell you the land costs this, the staff costs that. West Lothian, just to pick one out because that's our main area, they were very, very reasonable for burial fees for a long, long time. And then 3 years ago, they started to go up. So they went from basically, I think it was to purchase a layer, it went from 800 up to this year. We haven't got the figures for this year, but it's already £1,180. So that's a fair hike in a short period of time. We, rural funeral director, we do about 35 to 40% burial, which is unusual in Scotland because the cremation rates were roughly almost 78%. So we do a lot of burials, but we have noticed that this year, since there's been an extra hike last year, the burials rate has dropped significantly because people can't afford £2,500 to buy a layer. What they can do is they can have a cremation. And then, again, we sort of work the oracle there, and we buy ashes layers in the area. So we have a cremation, £1,200. We buy an ashes layer for £200 and odd pounds, and the ashes interment for £200 odd pounds. So they can actually have a cremation service and then bury the ashes in a local cemetery, special for that family, and it costs them less than it does to purchase and open the ground. So that's what we've tried to work at, and we also factor in that we have a service in our funeral homes and then an unattended cremation at the crematorium, which again saves the family well over £1,000. So we're doing everything we can to fit with what the public wants and what our public needs, but also what they can afford. But the drivers are burial fees have went up dramatically. You can speak to Edinburgh, was it 3.5, 4?
Just over £3,000.
Yeah, just over £3,000. You go to North Lanarkshire, it's always been very expensive for a number of years, but it's a very much, because of the setup of the population, it's very much a burial culture. Most of the people in that Motherwell area are Roman Catholic. They prefer a burial, and they're prepared to pay for it. But even now, we have a lot of masses that then go to the crematorium because it's too expensive. Is it justified? I can't argue. I don't have the figures. I remember speaking to Glasgow City Council years ago, and they say, "Oh, crematorium, it loses a fortune." But it loses a fortune because they put the budget in sports and recreation. The crematorium made money, but where they put the money lost money. Burial is expensive. Cremation is getting far more expensive, and I'm finding it hard to justify the cremation fees because our new fees come in the 1st of April, £1,300, which is really the hire of the room for 45 minutes, use of a TV screen and a music system and a cremation. Whereas they advertise unwitnessed and unattended cremation at £500 odd. So that's £700 just for the hire of the room, use of a TV and a music system. To me, how do you justify that? I can't, but their fees are guaranteed. They have no bad debt. They can charge what they want. It's a captive market. Does that? It's a very complicated situation. The question you asked is very complicated to answer, but it's a factor of many things. Some of it justified, some of it I would say less so.
I mean, I think where I'm trying to get at as well is round about the fact that there's calls for, a kind of a payment round about the £2,184 mark, which would, hopefully cover the lower end cost of a simple attended funeral. But where we're looking at a situation where, a layer in interment fees, if there's not already a layer there, my own authority area where I stay, would be over £2,000. So I'm trying to figure out at what point we can try and manage something like that within the envelope that a funeral support payment would cover, but the costs involved to the funeral directors and also to the person themselves, and where there's actually any movement in the system that can happen that doesn't end up being solely on the funeral directors and to try and reduce those costs.
Well, as I said earlier, we take money off, for respectful funerals, for funeral support payment funerals. The councils don't, the crematoriums don't. There's no feedback from them. It's, what they say is everybody's treated equally. Well, yes, they are, but you're supposed to, it's your members of your community as well who are paying your council tax who are not getting any help when they're in that financial hardship. But you go back to the council and say, I want you to make less money, and they'll tell you where to go because they have no money. That's a different argument, but that's where we are in reality.
Yeah. I think, Derry, did you want to?
Yeah. It was just that most local authorities don't have any, they don't have many avenues to increase revenue. So they can't generate revenue easily, but they can through cemeteries and through crematoria. And quite often, unless if you, and as we said earlier on, there's no check on how much they can increase them by, because the costs are going to be met by the funeral support payment anyway, because that's the way it's been set up. So if you're, it's almost like stealth increases. So if you had a burial this year, and if you're unlucky, somebody in your family died and it cost you £1,000 to bury somebody. They say that you an average of a funeral once every 7 years or something. So if you're unlucky enough to have another, unless you're unlucky enough to have another death next year, and then you notice that it was £1,000 this year, but it's £1,500 next year, that's £500 of an increase. Most people wouldn't know that because it's been a long time since maybe had a funeral. So you think it's just it's a way, I think, of councils increasing revenues because they can't increase them anywhere else. But when we're talking about what you should, the CMA make funeral directors publish a list of all their prices, and they have to be available on the website. They have to be available on funeral directors' premises. And I think at the minute the average costs £2,000, but we could, if there was some way of maybe pegging, if you take the average cost of that. We could if you could set that limit and say, well, that's the amount that across the piece would be an average amount that would meet a normal cost of a funeral.
Before you come in, just interested in what you were saying there, Jerry, because I think Elena and I have had this conversation before, whereby when we were councillors, albeit I was in South Lanarkshire, was income maximisation. And when we were sharing some stories, one of the things that came out was that Highland Council had actually created a pet cemetery in order to raise revenue as well. Do you remember that? A
couple of years ago, or maybe more than 10, 15 years ago, when councils went to resident and non-resident fees. Yeah. They would charge, if you were a resident in the council, you get charged a lesser amount. If you wanted to use from out with the council area, you get charged more. Quite a lot of councils did away with them, but went with the non-resident fee when they did away with them. So that was another sort of kind of stealth way of increasing of their revenues.
Okay.
Also, just when you mentioned Highland Council, they actually bill the client direct. They don't send the bill to the funeral director. But if you buy a layer in Highland, they bill the layer holder direct. It's the only council that I know actually do that.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
So it does work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
Just a question on that, because I think that in my estimation or my understanding, that the traditional role of funeral director really is to shoulder that burden and take that burden away from the family at a time where it's difficult for a family to be trying to pay everybody all over the place. So How does that kind of respectful part of it fit into it? But I understand your point about that takes the pressure away from yourselves and you're not left with that debt. And if that money could be paid from Social Security Scotland direct as well to you know, the Interment Authority, that could take the risk away at the same time. But how does that change the traditional role of the funeral director, where you would be that trusted organisation that would be doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problems with taking on that burden. That's what we've done since I was 12. Basically, the burden is there. We're quite happy to do it. And I'll be honest, from a commercial point of view, the last thing we would want to do is for crematoriums and councils to start billing clients' terms, because then the next step is, oh, well, why don't we just have our own funeral director, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. They can do it. There's a couple in England. I don't know how successful they've been, but the whole point is the council is the council. A funeral director is a different. We specialise in doing one thing: looking after the dead and the bereaved. That's what we do. You'll find that funeral directors now are not so much the old school, you know, arrange a day and a time. We are now funeral arrangers, like wedding planners, because funerals have become so elaborate. We don't have religious content anywhere near as much. So there's a lot more involved in a funeral than just picking someone up, looking after them, selling the coffin and taking them to the crematorium. There's a vast majority of funerals are not like that anymore.
John, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Yeah, I think in a few minutes we're going to talk about the flat rate of funeral support payment and whether it should increase. And I just to correctly join these two bits together. So were we to be talking about a higher rate of funeral support payment, for instance, I think it's important that that doesn't end up getting eaten up with costs at the other end, if you see what I mean. So, oh, well, there's a bit of extra wiggle room for, particularly for cremation fees or other costs like that to come in. I very much support local authorities trying to do income generation things like this, whether it's a pet cemetery, whether it's operating other things. We are ourselves a social enterprise. I'd encourage actually local authorities to set up something where it's not necessarily part of the local authority, but a multitude of social enterprise models that can generate income and compete in this kind of market, I think makes sense as an idea to set up. The limiting factor is there's only a small number of crematoria that are available in which a celebration of life or memorial service could take place in each area. So forget local authority boundaries. For each person in this country, there will only be a small number of things that could reasonably host that. Particularly in some parts of the country, burials, there's a clear worry about, in Edinburgh, we really don't have enough capacity, even a few years ahead. Those things drive up costs. That is a fixed market. And I think local authorities then also have to provide planning permission for new crematoria to open and end up with an accidental vested interest. Now, I think actually probably we've been saved by the fact that lots of councillors along the years have made decisions not necessarily in the local authority's best economic interests, but in the interests of people and the perceptions of people to have a place to go. So we have had more crematoria built. But again, that's often been like turkey voting for Christmas in terms of council income, because it provides an alternate place for people to go. I do think there's a call that, particularly if we're talking about increasing funeral support payment or otherwise regulating the funeral market, I do think it's incumbent on local authorities to have forward planning that means there's sufficient capacity in burials, that the prices don't spike because of a lack of capacity, and also sufficient choice for people in terms of how many places a cremation can happen. And it's not so much the cremation fees, it's the fact that a 30-minute, 40-minute celebration of life, there's so few places you can base that it becomes like a market that can almost charge whatever it likes, and it's only goodwill amongst councillors that's held that down.
Okay, no, thanks, John. Yeah, I'll bring you in quickly, Jim, but I'm going to invite Marie McNair to come in and facilitate the next theme. So if you could, all right, okay. Marie, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Convener. Marie McNair, representing Clydebank and Milngavie constituency in the west of Scotland. Take up funeral support plan that's sitting just now about 61% for those eligible. And there's kind of a wider kind of range of options in terms of when you're claiming, and the counterpart in the UK, DWP, sorry, I couldn't remember what it was called there. And obviously I know that the Scottish Government and other stakeholders have carried out a whole host of engagement on this, but how much awareness within the people you support is there of funeral support plan? And I'll probably go to Adam and John with that question first.
That's a good question. I don't think there's a huge amount of awareness of it, and I think this also boils down to sometimes death is similar to social care. It happens at a moment of crisis, and people maybe haven't been planning for this and thinking about it. But when you consider the either a low awareness and lowish uptake of income-related social security anyway, I think it's part of that picture. I think there's a lot more that can be done there. I think it's about whether our social security agencies in Scotland and in UK and through local authorities making people aware of other routes of support, not just when it comes to that crisis point, that they've maybe been thinking about it. Since the funeral support payment was introduced, we have distributed thousands of free information guides about it over the years. They're quite popular from people, but one of the challenges are that people, when they find out about it, it turns out they're actually not eligible. So those people who are thinking about it aren't in that category of eligibility anyway. Might be a little bit over. They might, as I talked about, that kind of gap of maybe, hundreds of thousands of people between eligibility for this sort of pension credit and actually paying income tax at all. They come to it and find that they actually can't claim for it or can't be supported by it. I think the Social Security Scotland have done a fairly good job with this. I know at the beginning of the year they had some publicity underway about the funeral support payment. Be quite good for these types of things to continue, and maybe it's a case that funeral directors are the ones that are actually alerting people at that moment, which I'm sure happens, and it's a very important thing to do, despite the fact that the financial challenges that might come with actually doing that too. So I think there are big challenges, people knowing what's for them, and I think also when you think about age profiles for all of this, a lot of information that we have, you might have heard me say this before, is wholly online. That's why free paper guides, phone calls to helpline advisors and all the rest of it is important to talk people through it, and not just have to go digging around somewhere online to find out what's for you. But there's all these different connection points in our social security system which could do a better job of that.
Thank you. And yourself, John? Are you aware of any kind of obvious barriers to folk being able to claim?
I think there is low awareness of funeral support payment. I don't necessarily see that as such a problem, though. For the reasons Adam said, it's in funeral directors' interest to raise it when people come forward. People in that crisis situation need to find out. And I actually slightly worry about the situation in which people think, oh, there's probably some benefit for me, when actually the vast majority of people aren't eligible for it. If you mean, it sounds a little bit, at the face value, you might think it sounds like a universal benefit. Not that people are conversant in things like universal benefit, but it sounds like, oh, well, the NHS gave me a free birth, if you maybe there is something there that the government covers around that. So I do, however, think we don't do nearly enough to raise awareness around bereavement and the consequences of that for people, about how hard it is to plan a funeral and how much we need to have people having these conversations. So there's both an education job about death, dying and bereavement, but just we can't do enough as a society to get people to talk about this. We know that in the event that people explain what their wishes are to one another, people save money out of that, if you so mean. We know that when people realise how expensive funerals are, because they are extraordinarily expensive, their opinions about what they want for themselves are changed, which is a good thing because they can articulate that. But also they might think, oh, actually, we need to think about how we're going to provide for that. We want to encourage as a society people to have money, not just for this kind of funerals, but for a rainy day, if it's something. So let's raise awareness. Let's make sure that we're helping people accommodate these kind of unexpected large costs and go through that thinking process. Because at the minute, the numbers something like 10% or something like that have fully articulated what their own funeral wishes are to their loved one that will be arranging that funeral. So it's far too low. If we can do that, that feels like a more important education task than the funeral support payment awareness raising, but for a weird reason, if that makes sense.
It's one of those conversations that everybody puts off at the end of the day. Do you have any kind of suggestions in terms of any kind of changes you could make to qualifying criteria?
For funeral support payment?
Yep.
Well, yeah, either it needs to be that there are people where they have no savings, extremely low income, are then able to claim it as a sort of, instead of having a qualifying benefit, and there might be a robust way of trying to work out those people's circumstances and a more involved system for that, by the way. Or I think a different benefit needs to have more clearly articulated that its job is to pick up some of those situations. And I do think that is around students. I do think it's around people who, lots of people don't claim pension credit, who if they were of working age would be claiming universal credit and that kind of category. On the other hand, pensioners aren't the group with the lowest provision for their funeral in general if they do die. You know, when people under pension age die, they do tend to have less money available, albeit less regularly. And then I think around the contribution-based benefits, I think specifically, I don't really understand why we're excluding contribution-based ESA. We rarely would be saying that's someone who has sufficient income, if you see what I mean. So there's a sort of quirk in the system just there. So I think if we could accommodate those, either through the FSP changing or just making another benefit aware that they have a role in picking up those well-assessed pieces, I think that would make a big difference.
Absolutely. Obviously, I was wanting to kind of ask Adam and John, but I can open it up to the Friends directors here if they get any kind of comments they want to make. Jim?
Just follow on from John there. I've long felt the council, believe it or not, in the council debt advice service could be wonderful helps here, because there are many people where the FSP takes, well, it says here 15 days. I'll not hold my breath on that one. But this is a crisis, you know. It could be tied into the Scottish Welfare Fund, the crisis loan, that sort of thing, which is still part of the same organisation. So if you have a crisis, you can go for the loan, so at least you've got some amount of money, even as a deposit, which can then be offset against what they're going to get from the FSP. That's what I would say. I mean, the councils know the vast majority of the people who are in financial difficulties because they are helping them with lots of things, be it kids at school, that's, you know, meals, whatever. The council is very much aware, your councillors here, very much aware of the families in their community that need help. But there's no connection between them and the FSP. You know, so top of my head, you know, someone comes to us, I have no money, blah, 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 and it's in our interest to take every client through what we think they're entitled to, but also to point them to areas where other experts, advice groups who can help them, because the amount of times I sit with a family and do the FSP application in our computer, on our computer, in our office, with the family present. Now, it's in my interest to do it, but it also assists the client greatly. So those are the two things that I would say, if we can have a coming together of the debt advice centres and what local councils have, marrying up information, they can contact the FSP team and say, this family, you know, blah, 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 we'll have the data here to say that they do need your help. That can fast-track things, I would say, but I'm not an administrator. I'm an undertaker, I have to say.
Jerry, you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about I don't know how you would go about the mechanics of it, but I think, you know, quite often you see as funeral directors, Jim's talking about, you'll know the people in your community that are needing the help, and quite often they're getting help because they're getting the benefits. The ones that we see that are in the most difficulty, mostly are the ones which are, I think, categorised sometimes as the working poor, are the ones who are just over the thresholds where they don't get any benefits. But actually, all it takes is one funeral to come along, and we're talking about tipping points, so that's absolutely tipped them over the edge in a lot of cases. So, you know, if we're looking at eligibility criteria and what we could do to, you know, I think if you to find some way of supporting those individuals, because they're the ones where, you know, if you're already in receipt of benefits, then you'll get some form of help from the funeral support payment. If you're just over that amount, but only just, you're stuffed currently.
Yeah, sorry.
So just very similar to what Jerry said just there. I think there's a misperception for some people that the deceased person, they were on some kind of benefits, and so therefore that the family would be eligible for FSP. And so what we find is we end up having to say, well, no, actually, it's not because that person was on benefits. It's your eligibility, and often those people are the people that Jerry's just spoken about, who are they're just managing, they're working, they're keeping their family going, they have no savings, they can live day to day, and that's okay. And suddenly they're the ones that are end up with a bill of many £1,000s. I think the other point that I just want to make on this, just to make it really clear as well, is there are cheaper options like a direct cremation that people can go for. You know, often that people in that category, you might think that would be a good solution, but the direct cremation is not necessarily the right thing for everybody in that scenario, sometimes due to cultural beliefs or whatever, but also just in terms of the type of funeral that is. It's not just the easy thing to catch on.
Yeah. Adam, you wanted to come in?
I'll just go back to a very earlier question. The numbers of people, maybe why there's people who are eligible, aren't claiming, which might be helpful. So from our third big survey, which was undertaken in December 4th, now the biggest one we've ever done, 4,400 over 50s, so the biggest single survey of older people in Scotland asking questions about the kind of funeral provision. I talked about it slightly earlier on, but and I think it goes to John's point as well about ages. If you're under 60, 15% of people say they've either got a funeral kind of plan is either updated or it needs a bit of a tweak, compared to sort of 51% of those people in their 80s that have got that kind of funeral plan. But looking at income levels as well, for those of incomes less than the kind of the pension credit threshold, 30% say they have a funeral plan and it states their current wishes, and another 6% say that they do have one but it needs updated. So there's about a third then, a little bit over a third, who on those low incomes that have a funeral plan, then depending on what that kind of scale is, they maybe then wouldn't be eligible for anything or barely anything under the funeral support payment because the financial provision's already been made. So while there might be, let's say, the pension credit element, there's quite a lot of people who have been thinking about this their whole life as well and made some provisions. I don't know how that actually works in reality for funeral directors and how that kind of works for those families in low income. But there is a substantial number of people that do have funeral plans. There's probably nowhere near enough. As I said before, a lot of people, equally those people who are on lowest incomes, quite a lot have a funeral plan. They're also the most likely than not to because they can't afford it. So in terms of those numbers, they're hot off the press in a sense, not been published anywhere else, and can submit them to the committee for the reference anyway.
That'd be helpful. Jim?
Also, just to say that you'll probably notice that the funeral trade is going head over heels promoting funeral plans like you wouldn't believe. So that is another way where we are trying to make sure that in later life people have a funeral plan, and with the new FCA funeral plans where they're all insured after 1 year, it means you can have a low cost plan or a traditional funeral which is insured to be paid for at the time of need. There's not enough take-up in that, I would suggest, because everybody's talking about, everybody's seen the adverts on TV, I won't mention them, but that's what you see all the time. And what they could actually do is have a chat with us, we can arrange their funeral wishes as they want it, work out an insurance-based price, and if something's to happen after 1 year, it's fully paid. That's an avenue that's not been explored by anybody, by any means, for a long, long time. And it's ignored.
Amy wants to come in, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go back to Andrew's point because if the bereavement charities were here, I think they would be saying we cannot go down the issue of direct funerals. They've done a lot of work post-COVID of what happened when people couldn't meet, when we couldn't have funerals. And I think it would be a very retrospect step if we suddenly said, because you haven't got the money, you have to have this type of funeral. And I think that's one thing we definitely do want to make clear, is that, firstly, however the payment is made, it is up to the family to decide which funeral director they go to. It's not saying you have to go to this one or that one, it's how that money is paid. But secondly, that they get that opportunity, however they want to be able to say their farewell to their loved one, but that is done in a way that is not restrained just by finances, because we are seeing a lot of still legacy of COVID funerals not happening. And I think if we were suddenly saying, just because you don't have money, you can't have what everybody else has, it would be quite a retrospect step within society.
Okay, thank you. I think John and Jerry. Thanks.
So, let me just quite quickly rattle through several things I agree with. Jerry's point about working poor people above the universal credit threshold, extremely important. I was about to agree strongly with something Andrew said, and I've completely forgotten which bit it was that you said just there. But separately, you start talking about direct cremation. It's worth saying, so we provide a lot of advice and impartial advice for people facing funeral poverty or just facing difficulty during bereavement. We also do arrange funerals for people across Scotland anywhere, and we only provide direct cremations just there. So just so you're aware, we have a role there. We're partly only doing direct cremations in that because there needs to be someone providing a bit of a backstop for people where they do have no other choice and they're going to fall back on a public health funeral and they do feel stigmatised by that. So we're sort of filling that gap. And separately, what we actually do as a business model to be a social enterprise is we cross-subsidise such that there is a growing market of people who want for themselves a direct cremation. So often there's people that are very well-meaning. They want to work with someone where it's a charity and know that by having a funeral through our services, we're aimed at cross-subsidising people where we have to take a risk, we lose money on them, people don't pay, and so we can help people in poverty. I just want to be clear, there are lots of people that direct cremation isn't for, if you see what I mean. So do not think that just because we're in that market as our social enterprise, it means that. I actually would love to have it such that there were funeral directors that were social enterprises across the country that could fill that gap for people who want burials, who want attended cremations, any kind of combination of the above. It's only that it's really, I can tell you from 10 years experience, it's really hard to get into this and hard to sustain. So that is a gap we have. But it's also partly caused by the fact that funeral support payment is so low at the moment. You know, it's better than nothing, absolutely. But it is so low that it kind of does drive that behaviour. Now, I do disagree a little bit with the idea that people have direct cremations and don't have memorial services. The vast, vast majority of people we work with, they do end up having a celebration of life or memorial of some sort, having had a direct cremation. It's that they're not locked into, there's only 2 crematoria and they're going to cost them £1,000 for half an hour and they can't afford that. When the pub, for £1,000, you can have a free bar for the whole afternoon or something like that, if you see what I mean. So people are using their money more wisely by saving it on the costs they can't control around direct cremation sometimes. So it's absolutely not for everyone. I definitely don't think we should be proposing it, and it certainly shouldn't be the thing that poorer people have that's entirely stigmatising. In fact, most people who have direct cremation are perfectly able to pay. It's that kind of flexibility it affords. But I don't want to get into the trap of thinking that direct cremation normally means people don't have a celebration of life. I do think that typically happens. The Sun Life report recently thought that 83% of people have a celebration of life afterwards, because I couldn't agree more. Without that, people often can't move through their bereavement process. Their grief is too great. You need these ritualistic elements. It's part of being a human and part of having that kind of connection. So, anyway, sorry to talk across a few different topics there.
I think it would be a mistake to say that people I think you would find it hard to find the evidence to say that people are being driven to take in direct funerals because they can't afford them. I think you'll find that the people that take direct funerals are people, what poorer families want, and I'm speaking from a funeral director of 39 years experience, but people at the lower economic scale, what they want from a funeral, and it varies conversely with their ability to pay. I think it'd be fair to say so. You know, that the people that are buying direct cremations are the ones who can well afford it, and it's a choice. The choice they're making is not to go to the crematorium. Whereas for the poorer families, the funeral, it's a ritual. It's something that takes place in their community. It's a show. They want to make the best of their mum, and you know, that's fine. But you know, you tend to find that what they expect and what they want of a funeral is at the other end of the scale from a direct cremation. So I think it'd be wrong to draw the assumption that people are being forced to take direct cremations. That's not the case.
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly, just to go back and John, I think it's going to be a postcode thing, because I say because we have funeral parlours in 5 locations, we can have a service. We can do the same as a creme in the funeral parlour and then have an unwitnessed thereafter. So we rarely ever hear of anybody having a direct and then a party, I have to say, because we sort of do it the way that we can do it. But I think you know, I don't know how many people you help, but I would imagine it is going to be a postcode lottery for what they can and can't have. I'll be honest. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Marie, are you?
Just the last few points I was going to make as well. You know, it's about dignity, and certainly prior to being an MSP, I was councillor in Western Barton, and it's something that we made sure happened. You know, we added in, like, you know, the celibate, you know, when it was a public health funeral. So it's good to see that that's happening in other authorities as well.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, that brings us to our last theme, and I'm going to invite Alexander Stewart in to facilitate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. The last theme is you've probably covered much of this in some aspects already, but it would be good to get a flavour of what improvements are needed to the administration of the funeral support payment, because you've all indicated the difficulties and the complexities that take place in managing that. So, you know, when it comes to the timescales, or when it comes to examples of the process itself, you will all have had experiences of that, good or bad. And from the discussion we've had this morning, you obviously have a good idea what needs to change, or what might need to change, and that would be quite good to hear if you think there are areas that require that when dealing with the administration of the plan and the payment, because we want to see improvements, and you're very much at the coalface of all of this, and that's important that we try and get that dialogue. And data is vitally important too, about how that's managed and how we can process that ourselves. So that's the area I have. So I don't mind who wants to jump in first, and we can continue the discussion. Jim, if you want to start.
If I could. First of all, the system does work well, but it needs tweaked, I'll be honest. I would say the main areas are communication. The FSP team are all they're concerned about is the dialogue with the applicant. But we're the partners here. If they don't talk to us, we don't know what's happening, things can go on. So even if we were to get a phone call or an email to say, this application looks like it's going to be, you know, it's going to be okay, I don't care if the money's in my bank account at that point. I just need to know it's coming. Okay? So better communication with us would be wonderful. Small point, very small point, please tell us the name of the person you're paying for when you pay us. Because if you get quite a few in, it's the same amount. We don't know what client it's for. And until the client gets a letter to tell them it's been awarded, we don't know whose money it is. So that's a small point, but better communication. The one thing I would say with the option to remove or to deflect the payment, I'm actually not in favour of taking it away completely, because there are occasions where the family will have already paid me and then make an application. I'm quite happy, you know, but you need to tell us this is what the client has requested, and we can say, well, that funeral's not been paid yet. So we've got a conflict there straight away. So, because at the moment, the Scottish Government, because they don't, sorry, the FSP team, because they don't talk to us, we're in the dark, monies are being deflected fraudulently, for want of a better word, and we know nothing about it. So that would be my main thing, communication, the option to deflect the money, as long as the funeral director is informed before it's sent. And just, you know, talk to us. We're, you know, some of us are ogres, some of us aren't. But we're partners in getting this over the line. And I say, the system is brilliant, it just needs that small administration change and obviously more money right at the start.
I agree with everything Jim said, but the only other thing would be that in the circumstances where the money is diverted to somebody other than the funeral director, would be some sort of some way whereby that could be relayed back to the FSP team, whether or not we get paid or not. So if in the fullness of time there was this great email that says this person's going to get it, and then we don't get it from either directly from the FSP team or from the family, there should be some sort of mechanism where the funeral director can go back and say, actually, you've given that person the money for us, but actually we're now telling you that we didn't get it.
Okay, there's quite a few folk with their hands up, to be perfectly honest with you. So there was Jerry, but then there was John, Elena, and I think Adam as well. So I'll bring John and then Elena, and thanks.
I do think we've covered the points, if you see what I mean. So I'm going to use time instead to kind of celebrate what the team are doing. There is a real difference between the DWP and the Social Security Scotland team in the sense of how human and flexible and the communications being better. That probably represents that there's more staffing involved in it. But I think we should celebrate it in a way that that acknowledges what happens to public services, which is when something's new and there's kind of a lot of investment in how you deliver it, and then everyone's had to learn it, and it's a new team that are kind of invested, things tend to work really well and slick, and there's plenty of capacity. And then if we went forward 20 years, I can imagine that becoming a team where it's people who are kind of getting a bit fed up and it feels very administrative and there's no joy in it. That's a funny thing to say, but this is life-changing for people. That there should be sort of joy in how you do these things as a government service here. So I feel like we should celebrate that it's surprisingly good for a benefits administration service on an international scale, and we should try to hold on to the fact that while it's kind of new and well supported as a staff team, we should keep making sure that's true for as long as possible, because it's absolutely no one in DWP's fault that the funeral expenses payment in England is a much worse administrative process. It's because it's been going for absolutely ages, and it's under-resourced as a team, not the investment in the benefit, the investment in the team. So let's not forget what we've got, if you see what I mean, and keep making sure we invest in that, because they're surprisingly human, relational. Jim, there might be issues with communications, but really surprisingly good at communicating for that kind of team. So we should pass on credit where it's due.
Okay. Thank you. Elena?
Yeah, as a former welfare benefits advisor, I'm going to pose a question that I probably would not want any of my clients ever to have been dealing with, but it was something that Derry just said there that made me think about the fact that is there not actually a mechanism just now where it's understood by Social Security Scotland if a claimant has received a payment and then did not use it for its intended purposes? Is there not that actual loop at the moment? Because in any other situation, if you were not using, well, you really wouldn't, if a crisis loan or things like that are not used for their intended purposes, there's no comeback on that either, I suppose. But I'm just wondering if there's no kind of look back to that to show that something's not been used. Is there no stats actually collected at the moment on that? Do we not really have a full understanding of how many incidences that actually happens in?
That's right.
Because there's no ability to then ask for that money back in terms of an overpayment by Social Security Scotland, I would imagine. I
think you're absolutely right. And there are often times when the family say that they're going to apply, and we say, great, that's super, and then we don't hear anything more from them. We don't know whether that's been successful or not. If it has been successful, the money might have gone to them, and we're still left with the debt. And I think just on Jim's point, we are a partner in this situation, and so for us to be able to know that there's been a payment awarded would be great, and then for the payment to come to us would be even better, because that then pays that person's debt. And in reality, that's what that money should be for, is to pay that person's debt, not necessarily just to go into their bank account. But at the moment, we don't know whether that has even been awarded. And so we sit there thinking, well, hopefully that money is going to come. We try and get in contact with the client, and they can decide to turn off their phone and not answer our calls.
I suppose in the same way as if housing payments are paid directly to a claimant and then it's not used to pay the rent, there's not a clawback from the system to that claimant in that respect, but there's a consequence in terms of eviction proceedings could come forward. So it's just trying to figure out what would be the potential. How would we minimise that happening? Because you don't want that to happen to people.
I do think they're quite different situations, though, because with a crisis loan, for instance, we quite often help with Milo Hut in a different charity. We quite often help people where they need a washing machine or something. So if they get the loan and don't spend on the washing machine, they still don't have the washing machine. In the sense of a housing, they're at risk of losing their house. There's kind of nothing to lose for people. I mean, again, most people are paying us. You can trust people with money 99% of the time. The 1% wouldn't be a worry. It's the ripple effect on everyone else outside of that 1% who are using it incorrectly. But yeah, I'm absolutely sure there's no statistics on it.
And there isn't much. So if you get the money for the funeral, for instance, and then you don't give it to the funeral, if you don't pay your rent, then you lose your house. If you don't pay the funeral director, well, what happens? Because we've done the funeral. They have economic circumstances which would make it unlikely that even if we were to take them to court or to take them to debt collection, the chances of recovery are almost zero. And we've done the funeral, we've incurred the debt. Not only have we incurred the debt, we've also had to pay the cemetery or the crematorium.
The only thing that we ever get from the FSD is a phone call to confirm the applicant on the account. That's it. And the amount, sorry. We get a phone call and that's it. When we get that phone call, we're pretty 99% sure the money's going to be coming. But that's normally the day or 2 days before the actual money's actually sent. So that's the only contact we ever get for the FSP is of we do the initial contact with the client on their computer and then they phone us up and they ask for the date of the funeral, which in our case it's got to be fictitious because we haven't arranged it yet because we're waiting on the money coming in. That sort of thing. But the other thing, which I apologise, I had it written down in my notes but I forgot all about it, is when we issue an invoice, pay the invoice. So if we issue an invoice for £1,600 for a direct cremation, just pay that. But you're paying £2,500, which then we've got to give back to the client. And that, to me, again, is a kind of social engineering. You know, it pushes people, well, if I don't have a funeral and I have direct cremation, I'm going to get £800 or £900 in my pocket. And people financially constrained, that's a lot of money. So that was another thing I forgot to mention, sorry.
To mirror John's optimism and positivity about the system, actually the application processes for people is pretty good. Actually, you know, you think about the application form, if you've got it, you know, it might look like it's 30 pages, but it's not much per page. It's not like some of the other challenging social security elements to kind of get through. There's lots of quite simple tick boxes and also OK Online. And the support you can get from Social Security Scotland to do that is really good. So I think that they've really thought about this well, and the colleagues at Age Scotland who support people with form filling in and that look at our information services are very positive about it, which I think that's something to be applauded, and I think that's consistent with a lot of the work that Social Security Scotland do.
John?
I agree. It's a good system. There's a small number of cases where people aren't eligible, and effectively, if they came to us or they came to a welfare rights advisor, the welfare rights advisor will say, "Hang on, like it's that you're not claiming pension credit, and you should be, or you could claim universal credit in your circumstance, and you haven't been, or you know, if you just change the way you're doing this, like we had." Young man recently who just didn't want to claim benefits because he feels stigmatised by benefits. And like, okay, if you just claim for like a short period, this could really make a big difference to your life. So I do think there's something in the feedback around people who are being rejected that just says, you know, rather than effectively putting the onus on the third sector to do this for people, that says actually you might just want to check whether you're eligible for pension credit, and here's how to do this. You might want to check if you're eligible for universal credit, because the form is almost so simple that the team wouldn't have all of those facts to hand, and just a few minutes spent saying, actually, can I just check, like, wait a second, you're actually, you know, you're in work poverty, and you've got 2 kids. Actually, you might well have a universal credit claim that could go in. Something that just did a very quick check to see if people were maybe likely to be eligible for one of the qualifying benefits might just help. But that would be a benefit. I think it's generally speaking the public sector pushes that into the third sector. It would be kind and generous for that to be slightly built into the process.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone get any further questions or comments?
I'm conscious we went through the 4 topics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
no, thank you.
You know, I think the elephant in the room is funeral support payment is an excellent benefit. It is more generous than it has been previously in some ways. But in the grand scheme of like the last 20 years, CPI has risen in the last 20 years by 99%. So prices have roughly doubled and funerals have gone up by 146%. When funeral directors talk about it, there's no element of this where it's kind of greed or it's all because of the lack of burial spaces. It's a nuanced point that says that actually a lot of the costs in this sector have gone up. It's complicated. You know, we can't pin the blame on it being like the employer NI rise or something like that. It's a long-term issue, and it also involves people's preferences changing over time and things like that. But funeral costs have gone up. If you go back 20 years, the gap between what a attended, typical, simple funeral would cost and the amount you could claim from benefits when you were obviously someone that safety net was intended for where you're in poverty was a relatively small and manageable gap. The gap has risen to be too big. It's either hundreds of pounds, but more commonly like just under £2,000 for people between the average FSP payment for someone who is eligible and the average cost in Scotland, where funerals are actually a bit cheaper than elsewhere, for an attended funeral. And remember, you know, my social enterprise business bit doesn't talk about attended funerals, so other funeral directors might think this is in their commercial interests. You can trust me on this in the sense that I have no commercial interest in this happening. It needs to be that the flat rate payment is is higher to reflect that. Having worked with the Poverty Alliance and Down to Earth, which is part or related to Quaker Social Action in England around funeral poverty, we've come to the conclusion that the best way of pegging it to something that's a real trackable cost is to look at the Competition and Markets Authority rate for what funeral director fees are, which is the 2,400, I'm sorry, it's got written on this page, 2,484 was the last figure they produced, and they produced that on a regular basis. That gives something that can tack, that's not just saying CPI inflation is relevant to funerals, because it just isn't. Like funerals just, it isn't a product on a shelf. Like things go up and down in different ways. It would make sense for this to be a benefit that was generous enough that it meant that a median person having a very simple funeral with no orders of service, no funeral, no flowers, all that kind of, no, you know, not big limos and things, a median person in those circumstances wasn't going into debt as a result. And that's not because we should just be more generous for people in bereavement, although we should. It's because that's an investment in avoiding people falling into poverty later. £1,800 of debt being saddled on an average person in those situations who's already eligible for the funeral support payment, which means they're amongst the poorest in our society. They are people who are not going to get themselves out that debt spiral in the next few years. It means that their bereavement turns into a lifetime of debt and problems and feeling like that bereavement was a much bigger long-term impact on poverty. So being more generous, pegging it to something that genuinely reflects funeral costs to a greater degree in the flat rate is an investment in preventing poverty in the long run. And I just think we need to make sure we're not falling for the idea that we should compare what we get this year to what we got last year. We need to be thinking about over a decade's period, funerals has become something that's more of a tipping point into poverty, and we can rectify that at really, Adam outlined it before, really surprisingly low cost compared to any other poverty intervention that would be about picking up the pieces instead of having prevention up front.
Okay, thanks very much, John. I'm conscious of the time as well, so I'm going to try and obviously wrap it up now. So I want to say thank you today for your evidence. I could sit here listening to you and got lots of questions as well on it, but I really think at the heart of it, it's about how, from what we've heard today, is how we take that forward, you know, and it's about people and having, you know, a dignified celebration of their life as well. So we'll have a chat based on, you know, what we've discussed today as well. So if there are any other points as well that you know, you didn't have a chance to put forward, then, you know, you're welcome to follow up in writing with us as well. And I know you are all very, very busy. So that concludes our public business for today, and we'll now move into private, and thank you once again.